Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We got a great week ahead of us. We have a great day scheduled today as well. We got Mr. John O'Loughlin, as you guys all know. We're getting to know his warm cup of coffee welcome in the morning at 11 a.m. We got George Webb at 12 p.m. and then we got Mark Kulak at 2 p.m. So make sure you stay tuned to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com after the show. And for all of you on the McDuff channels, we make sure you go to McDuff Lives 3 as well. I will be putting up that up on the screen here shortly, so you guys all know where to find McDuff when his YouTube channels get taken down. But John, thank you once again for kicking off the week, and have a great show.
Well, thank you, Andy DeBala, with a very generous introduction there. And I'm happy to be back here with Neighborhood News Studio and all the great guys there. I said hi to Aaron this morning, and it's good to be hooked up with colleagues and people have their hearts in the right places. And I know that's true of everyone at Neighborhood News Studio. I am wanted to make sure that everyone knows that my permanent channel is McDuff Lives 3. And just so that, to let everybody know that, I'm also broadcasting this morning on McDuff Lives and McDuff Lives 2, not because I want to stay there, but just because there's 8,000 or more people that watch me over there. And because of strikes, I had to just shut them down for a couple of months. So now I just wanted to let you know that please subscribe to McDuff Lives 3 to stay in tune and in touch with all the stuff we're doing here at McDuff Lives and ScreamingOspreys.com. So, and once again, Jumping Mouse, who's here in the chat room, yay, Mouse, is maintaining our website, ScreamingOspreys.com, where you can always find a calendar of everything that's going on. And she also makes our weekly memes, which I always appreciate. She has a great sense of how to construct a nice graphic. And all right, and so there was what you can see over at the website. There's my book with my dad there standing on his beloved ship, the USS Nashville, happy, smiling, doing what he wanted to do in life. And so thank you so much. Thank you for considering becoming a Patreon. If that's a possibility for you, I do appreciate the support, and it's the easiest way for me to manage it. Also have kind of just for fun, we've got the Screaming Osprey coffee mugs now at the it's one of those cafe press things. So I suppose we make a little money off of them, but they're really just for enjoyment. So cheers, everybody. Yeah, hey, just so welcome everyone, and if you're just now picking up from McDuff Lives or McDuff Lives 2, thanks so much for migrating over to McDuff Lives 3, and yeah, okay, Tehran got 3 notices. That means we're successful. And top of the morning to you, Tyro, Christy Liebel, Baker is here. And great being here. Shouts and Jimmy Beam. Yes. And cheers to everyone. Well, as usual, I'm always receiving books in the mail and studying them and then, coming up with what I consider to be worthwhile connections. And this morning, I want to talk about something that I probably haven't really appreciated enough myself. And it's a dark topic. It's called the slave power. Okay. And I want to look at it through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson, who is always somebody we can look to what were the intellectuals thinking during the colonial and revolutionary times, and then of course afterwards up until he survived until 1825. But let me just give you my general idea of what's going on here. When the country got founded, United States, the Revolution, there was really two different countries, and almost the agricultural South and um, the merchant and small farming, but capitalist North that's coming together quickly around New York City and Boston, and but also this is money that comes from overseas trade, and overseas trade in that era was sugar, timber, opium, but also what else? Human beings, human cargo. So it was a mixed group of states that were very different from one another, the North and the South in a broad sense, and then individual states with different variations inside of them. But to keep it at a very big, let's just step back and look at it from afar. Um, yeah. So yeah, that's not, yeah. Okay. So this map does show the British system of what's called the triangular trade. Mm. Well, the distinction I'm making between the North and the South doesn't mean that one's good and one's bad. We're just trying to establish the basic differences. And the wealth that is accumulated in the North is basically from trade or manufacture. But the trade includes transportation of slaves, as well as transportation of raw materials and uh, quote spices, unquote, which is, just to say that the North wasn't innocent of slavery. And of course, you can see, that there were slaves in the North, there were slaves in New York, there were slaves in Connecticut, and there were, uh, until the time of the Revolution, generally legal. In studying the difference, what I'm trying to decide, remember we talked about the New England WASP Society, the old money that's based on the shipping and the trade, and we could call it the Sullivan and Cromwell group, with Allen Dulles and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the wealth of the New England states versus an entirely different type of wealth based upon agriculture. And that wealth based upon agriculture is in the South. And in the South, the dominant economy is Virginia. Maryland is close back then. Maryland was a very, very um, successful economy in comparison to places like North Carolina, for instance. So, but Maryland and Virginia were the two biggest slave owning states at the time of the Revolution. And it's basically from Virginia that the Confederacy gets populated, and the political attitudes of the people in power in those southern states came from the political attitudes of those in power in Virginia that made money from agriculture and slaves. So that in the early 1800s, most the the biggest export of the state of Virginia. Right now it's tobacco, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But what was it in 1820 or so? It was slaves, and that created wealth. Now, with that kind of introduction, I want to read an essay about the slave power that was written for Executive Intelligence Review, published on May 8th, 2015. And I think, Andy, I'll just share it from here so that people can see the pictures that are contained in it and read along if they like to. It's the reason that this is so striking to me is that number one, it gives me a renewed confidence in George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and their, you know, you don't know if those, what was really in their minds looking back from all of these decades and hundreds of years. But scholars have studied this, and I think this is a really worthwhile article to uh, to put everything in perspective. And also, as I said, I'm trying to tie things together, both historically, geographically, culturally, in a way that we can understand today better. And so if you think of me separating the Yankees and the Cowboys in Carl Oglesby's book about the Yankee and Cowboy War, that's an effort to understand what are the big forces in play. What's in play here? And certainly the slave power was the most important player in the South at the time of the revolution and thereafter. And it was fighting against the commercial interests centered in Manhattan. So let's just go ahead and read some from this article. Let me check back and make sure that it's showing up. Yes. Okay. All right. There are myths and counter myths surrounding the early history of the United States of America. It is often difficult for the mere observer to discern what was actually going on and what the nature of the battle was. This document will demonstrate that from the very beginning, this nation was defined by a titanic war between two opposing forces, opponents who differed not merely on practical political issues, but on the very nature of the human species itself. On the one side was the New York leadership who created the United States Constitution and defined the mission of the United States during the presidency of George Washington. Against them were arrayed the Virginia Combine of the Southern slave power, an anti-human aristocracy who were determined that it would be the slaveocracy of the South who would control the future destiny of the nation. This is the story of that battle. The very definition of humanity, I think that's such a great point to make, because if it's okay to enslave humans, then there must be some gradations between humans that are competent to be masters and humans that are only competent to be slaves. And anyway, the point is we are now at the very root of a decision as to what type of humanity does America respect. And I think right now we're still struggling with that. Notice how Columbia University is involved already. In the years immediately prior to the American Revolutionary War, 4 young graduates of King's College, today's Columbia University, in New York City began a friendship, a personal bond from which sprang forth the leadership of a new nation. This bond was strengthened and deepened during the years of the American War for Independence, a war which also witnessed the beginning of their intimate relationships with George Washington, and later, in 1787, it would be these 4, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, and Robert Livingston, who performed the vital role in the creation of the finished form of the United States Constitution, as well as in that document's successful ratification 1 year later. Beginning in 1789, 3 of these individuals, Hamilton, Jay, and Morris, would form the nucleus of the leadership in the new presidential administration of George Washington, a presidency whose nature can only be grasped by recognizing that it was a, quote, New York administration, unquote. They were joined and supported by other key New Yorkers, including Stephen Van Rensselaer, Philip Schuyler, and Isaac Roosevelt, along with Hamilton's protege, Rufus King, who moved from Massachusetts to New York at Hamilton's urging. Later, the legacy of this grouping would be continued through the efforts of DeWitt Clinton, James Fenimore Cooper, and others. Even before the inauguration of Washington, stretching back to the Constitutional Convention and earlier the philosophy and policy of what would become in 1789, New York administration was ruthlessly and bloodily opposed by the slave interests of the South. There are 2 related delusions concerning slavery and the American Republic. The first is that the founding fathers were either pro-slavery or at least tolerant of that institution. The second is that slavery did not emerge as a decisive national crisis until the 1830s or 1840s, or until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The truth is that beginning with the inauguration of George Washington in 1789, war was declared against that administration by the slave power. And beginning with the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, the Southern slave power unleashed a relentless, unceasing effort to increase its power, expand geographically, and ultimately take over the entire nation. Wow. So the slave power, Thomas Jefferson, was intending to take over the entire nation. And of course, that includes the expansion, which was already underway to the west. Let's go over to Monticello for a moment and check out what Monticello says about Jefferson's attitudes towards slavery. All right, over to Monticello's website, and here we go. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, and yet enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his life. Although he made some legislative attempts against slavery and at times bemoaned its existence, he also profited directly from the institution of slavery and wrote that he suspected black people to be inferior to white people in his Notes on the State of Virginia. Throughout his entire life, Thomas Jefferson was publicly a consistent opponent of slavery, calling it a moral depravity and a hideous blot. He believed that slavery presented the greatest threat to the survival of the new American nation. Jefferson also thought that slavery was contrary to the laws of nature, which decreed that everyone had a right to personal liberty. These views were radical in a world where unfree labor was the norm. At the time of the American Revolution, Jefferson was actively involved in legislation that he hoped would result in slavery's abolition. In 1778, he drafted a law that prohibited the importation of enslaved Africans. In 1784, he proposed an ordinance that would ban slavery in the Northwest Territories. But Jefferson always maintained that the decision to emancipate slaves would have to be part of a democratic process. Abolition would be stymied until slave owners consented to free their human property together in a large scale act of emancipation. To Jefferson, it was anti democratic and contrary to the principles of the American Revolution for the federal government to enact abolition or for only a few planters to free their slaves. Although Jefferson continued to advocate for abolition, the reality was that slavery was becoming more entrenched. The slave population in Virginia skyrocketed from 292,000 to 469,000 in 1830. Jefferson had assumed that the abolition of the slave trade would weaken slavery and hasten its end. Instead, slavery became more widespread and profitable. In an attempt to erode Virginian support of slavery, he discouraged the cultivation of crops heavily dependent on slave labor, specifically tobacco, and encouraged the introduction of crops that needed little or no slave labor: wheat, sugar maples, short-grained rice, olive trees, and wine grapes. But by the 1800s, Virginia's most valuable commodity and export was neither crops nor land, but slaves. Jefferson's belief in the necessity of ending slavery never changed. From the mid-1770s until his death, he advocated the same plan of gradual emancipation. First, the transatlantic slave trade would be abolished. Second, slave owners would improve slavery's most violent features by bettering, Jefferson used the term ameliorating, living conditions and moderating physical punishment. Third, all born into slavery after a certain date would be declared free, followed by total abolition. Like others of his day, he supported the removal of newly freed slaves from the United States. Well, the unintended effect of Jefferson's plan was that his goal of improving slavery as a step toward ending it was used as an argument for its perpetuation. Pro slavery advocates after Jefferson's death argued that if slavery could be improved, abolition was unnecessary. Jefferson's belief in the necessity of abolition was intertwined with his racial beliefs. He thought that white Americans and enslaved blacks constituted, quote, two separate nations who could not live together peacefully in the same country. Jefferson's belief that blacks were racially inferior and as incapable as children, quote unquote, coupled with slaves' presumed resentment of their former owners, made their removal from the United States an integral part of Jefferson's emancipation scheme. Influenced by the Haitian Revolution and an aborted rebellion in Virginia in 1800, Jefferson believed that American slaves' deportation, whether to Africa or the West Indies, was an essential follow-up to emancipation. Jefferson wrote that maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. He thought that his cherished federal union, the world's first democratic experiment, would be destroyed by slavery. To emancipate slaves on American soil, Jefferson thought, would result in a large-scale race war that would be as brutal and deadly as the slave revolt in Haiti in 1791. But he also believed that to keep slaves in bondage with part of America in favor of abolition and part of America in favor of perpetuating slavery could only result in a civil war that would destroy the Union. Jefferson's later prediction was correct. In 1861, the contest over slavery sparked a bloody civil war and the creation of two nations, Union and Confederacy, in place of one. So says Monticello. So there's Jefferson from Monticello's side. Just to be fair, More was at stake than simply the institution of slavery. The first Washington administration, well, let me go ahead and share this too so you can have the pictures. More was at stake than simply the institution of slavery. The first Washington administration was an experiment as to whether the principles of the new American Constitution, a constitution steered to its completion by New Yorkers, might succeed in practice. It was the administration of Alexander Hamilton's creation of a national bank and Hamilton's formation of the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures. The Washington presidency was the battleground for the creation of a type of republic never before existent in human history. From the beginning, the mortal enemy of this design was the slave power of the South. John Jay and Robert Livingston met as students at King's College in the mid 1760s, and they became the closest friends until their break in 1792 to 4. Within a few years, Governor Morris was part of their group, and this trio was to provide the revolutionary leadership for New York State during the ensuing decade. Hamilton, the youngest of the group, was a slightly later addition, but it was this final arrival whose destiny was to be the greatest of them all. All four emerged from or were linked to a network of prominent New York families, including the Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, Schuylers, and Morrises. Alexander Hamilton and Stephen Van Rensselaer both married daughters of Philip Schuyler, and John Jay married one of the daughters of Walter Livingston. During the Revolution, not only that's a picture of King's College, later Columbia University. During the Revolution, not only did Hamilton serve as Washington's most trusted aide, but it was Jay, Livingston, and Morris who became Washington's most vigorous defenders in the Continental Congress. Morris and Livingston defended Washington against repeated attempts to remove him from command. And throughout the war, no one fought harder than Morris to secure food, ammunition, and medical care for Washington's troops. It is vital to recognize that to a very real extent, the leadership of the later Washington presidency was forged, so to speak, over the campfires of war by individuals who served directly with Washington during that conflict, including Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, Henry Knox, John Marshall, and Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. These individuals, together with others not named here, remained unassailable in their loyalty to Washington until the moment of his death. In 1774, after the British government closed the port of Boston, a committee is formed under John Jay's leadership to organize a new revolutionary government for New York State, the New York Provisional Congress. Morris and Livingston are elected as representatives to the new legislature, and Jay is the first delegate chosen to the new Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In 1776, the New York Provisional Congress, at the urging of Jay and Morris, authorized their representatives in Philadelphia to vote for independence. Livingston serves on the Committee of Five, together with Franklin, Jefferson, Sherman, and Adams, who draft the final version of the Declaration of Independence. Later that year, Jay and Morris author a new constitution for New York State, and elections are held to form a new state government. Jay is elected Chief Justice, Livingston Chancellor, and their ally Philip Schuyler is barely defeated by governor by George Clinton. From 1781 to 1783, Gouverneur Morris, together with Robert Morris, are the vital leaders in reorganizing the nation's finances and staving off national bankruptcy, and together they found the Bank of North America. John Jay serves as ambassador to Spain, and then, at the request of Franklin, proceeds to Paris to aid Franklin in securing the final peace treaty which ends the war. A continuing lie surrounding the United States Constitution is that Alexander Hamilton played a minor role at the convention. The truth is that there would have been no Constitution without Hamilton. He was the initiator of the project and almost single-handedly responsible for the convening of the convention in 1787, and afterwards, Hamilton was the driving force for ratification in 1788. Hamilton's campaign to replace the Articles of Confederation is well known, and the details will not be repeated here, except to emphasize his role in initiating the Annapolis Convention, which met September 12, 1786, and ended 2 days later with the Hamilton-authored Annapolis Resolution, calling for the convening of a national convention in Philadelphia to be attended by all the states. This was Hamilton's project from the beginning. Well, the text now goes into the competing plans for the Constitution, which you may remember from eighth grade history, American history. The Philadelphia Convention opened with the Virginia Plan, which came from James Madison. And uh, his idea was just a general social contract. It was pretty much not much more than the Articles of Confederation. Um, Hamilton uh, met with George Washington, and he took over the whole proceedings on June 18th, spoke for 6 hours, and presented his own uh, vision for the new government. And without trying to read it all, let's just go down. Here is what Hamilton and Morris accomplished. First, the establishment of a strong, independently elected executive through the office of the presidency. Secondly, the inclusion of a broad general welfare clause, both within the body of it and, more importantly, the Morris authored preamble, which charges the national government to protect and defend the general welfare. Well, it says to promote the general welfare, as I recall. The establishment of a strong independent judiciary, attacked states' rights and localism, and Morris led a critically important fight over slavery at the convention. Practically alone, he waged this fight all the way through to the closing hours. The Three-Fifths Clause, which vastly inflated the national political power of the slave states, was adopted against Morris's intense opposition. Okay, and here's the words. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. You are reading not only the words of Governor Morris, but the principle which he, and together with Hamilton, embedded in the founding document. Morris versus the slaveocracy. The great untold story of the convention is that the slave interests of the South, led by Virginia, were determined and unyielding that the final agreement would lead to a domination of the new nation by the slaveocracy. Their power and their system was to be enshrined with legal finality in the founding document of the nation. This included their demands for enhanced political power based on their total slave population, for no restrictions to be placed on the slave trade, for no restrictions on the expansion of slavery into the territories, and for the use of various clauses in the Constitution dealing with property rights to protect slave ownership. James Madison's original Virginia plan called for one-to-one representation of the slaves for determining an individual state's number of representatives. In 1790, Virginia had 435,000 free and 300,000 slaves, while Pennsylvania had 434,000 free and no slaves. Under the Madison Plan, Virginia representation would be based on 735,000 people. They almost got away with it, but there was enough opposition. James Wilson of Philadelphia proposed the Three-Fifths Compromise. On July 11th, Governor Morris rose to speak at the convention to reopen the already decided issue of the Three-Fifths Clause. The fight was not over, and during the next 2 days there were heated exchanges, with only Morris repeatedly taking a strong anti-slavery position in the face of Southern threats to walk out of the convention. And here is a quote from Morris I would like to read. Upon what principle is it that slaves should be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves that cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and, in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice. And he goes on. At the conclusion of his speech, Morris proposed one small editorial change to insert the word free before the word inhabitants, which would, of course, eliminate all slave representation. Morris's motion was rejected. The convention reinstated the three-fifths representation, and that ended the debate. South Carolina led the fight in demanding an unrestricted slave trade. Morris counterattacked, speaking repeatedly, even at one point proposing that the Constitution prohibit the slave trade, but that Virginia, Georgia, and South and North Carolina be exempted due to their commitment to, quote, human bondage, unquote. This caused a furor on the convention floor. Eventually, James Wilson proposed another compromise, allowing the slave trade to continue for 20 years and imposing a head tax on imported slaves. Morris spoke sharply against it, but it passed. The effect of this compromise was that over the next 20 years, from 1790 to 1810, 203,000 slaves were brought into the United States, compared with only 56,000 in the previous 20 years. The last slave-related issue was that of runaway slaves. The convention had already agreed to a clause requiring governors to surrender criminals for extradition to other states. But on August 28th, the South Carolina delegation demanded that fugitive slaves must be included in the definition of criminals. Wilson again proposed a compromise whereby slaves would not come under legal extradition agreements, but slave owners would have the legal right to enter into other states or hire someone to do this for them and seize their runaway slaves, i.e., recover their rightful property. This was the origin of all later fugitive slave laws, and again, Morris was vehement in his opposition. Here's a picture of Washington and his cabinet. Let's see, it's John Jay, Hamilton standing up there, Jefferson, and who is that other guy on the right? I'm not sure. So then the essay goes on and talk about what Hamilton's plan, which is his idea of developing the country through manufactures and transportation and building canals and supporting the government, supporting industry, which Jefferson, of course, was completely against, because the Jeffersonians relied on agriculture for money and not upon manufacture, which they felt was kind of inhuman in a way. I don't know if that's the right way to put that, since they're the ones that hold the slaves. But something about what we talked about once a couple of months ago, Semper Eadem, which is still the motto of Prince George's County, Maryland. And it was Queen Elizabeth I's motto. And what it means is everything is always the same, always the same. Don't don't make big changes. Plantations are the way to go. Let's just keep on with a nice, you know, wise master running the whole show, and all the people doing their jobs. Just doing their jobs. And of course, they get punished if they don't do their jobs, but that's the way it is. And may it always be that way. The Jay Treaty was the next big political issue, which was faced by um, Jefferson and Hamilton. And the idea was to do business with Great Britain, which Jefferson, being, Francophile, was against. And it really just nearly just divided the country. All right, let me get on to this part here called the slave power. It is the case that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, many leading Americans expected slavery to be abolished within a relatively short period of time. Unlike in 1860, when Southern leaders would regularly invoke God to defend the morality of slavery, in 1788, even many in the South admitted the horror of the institution, and it was apparent to the majority of Americans that the continuation of slavery and the principles of the Declaration of Independence were incompatible. Prior to 1770, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, but by 1790, all the states north of Maryland had either emancipated their slaves or taken steps in that direction. During the Revolutionary War, Hamilton's close friend John Laurens had introduced a bill in the South Carolina legislature for statewide emancipation, for which he received a congratulatory letter from George Washington. At the same time, a substantial number of Southern slave owners freed their slaves, either outright or in their wills. George Washington was one of these. The eccentric John Randolph of Virginia was another. John Dickinson, once Delaware's largest slaveholder, sided openly with Gouverneur Morris against slavery at the Philadelphia Convention and freed all of his slaves. The most compelling case is that of Edward Coles, one of the largest slave owners in Virginia, and an individual of equal social rank to Jefferson. Coles gathered up all his slaves, transported them to the Northwest Territory, loaded them all out on rafts and barges in the middle of the Ohio River, climbed up on a crate, and announced to all of them that he was setting them free. He established a fund to aid them in getting started. Upon his return to Virginia, he wrote to Jefferson, urging him to do the same thing. Jefferson replied that it was not the right time. Additionally, in the North, it was believed or hoped by many anti-slavery advocates that the success of Hamilton's economic policies and the increasing commercial and industrial prosperity of the nation would lead to the general recognition of the counterproductive nature of slave labor as an economic system and compel the South to abandon it. What halted this momentum, this directionality, was not the invention of the cotton gin, as some historians claim. It was the election of Jefferson to the presidency in 1800 and the ironclad grip over the national government by the Virginia slave power for the next 24 years that changed the future of the nation. By 1824, the slaveocracy had placed itself in a position of dominant national power, and except for the 4 years of the John Quincy Adams presidency, it would retain that power until 1861. Between 1800 and 1860, the number of slaves in the United States grew from 800,000 to 4 million. More important than the simple numbers was the unyielding Southern determination to spread slavery geographically. During his presidency, Thomas Jefferson became a vocal advocate for the Southern doctrine of diffusion. Jefferson wrote that spreading slavery into new areas would benefit the economies of these newly settled regions, while at the same time decreasing the concentration of slaves in the South, making them more valuable as property, and resulting in better treatment for the Southern slaves, thus lessening, that is, diffusing, the likelihood of slave revolts. Now, 1787 Northwest Ordinance had banned slavery in all of the Western Territory north of the Ohio River. The South's interpretation of that ordinance was first that they were going to ignore it, continue to bring slaves into the Northwest, and eventually overturn it. And second, since there was no mention of the area south of the Ohio River, that area was de facto open for slavery. Two new states, Kentucky and Tennessee, were carved out of the territory previously claimed by Virginia and North Carolina. Almost all the settlers were natives from those two states, and many had brought their slaves with them. Kentucky and Tennessee were admitted 1792 and 96. In the Northwest Territory, many of the initial settlers were from Virginia and later Kentucky, and despite Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, by the time of Ohio's admission to the Union as a free state in 1800, slavery was entrenched in much of the rest of the territory. As early as 1788, the territorial agent for the area that later became the states of Illinois and Indiana asked Congress to modify the Northwest Ordinance to allow slavery, and his report was endorsed by James Madison. In 1802, a convention of settlers meeting at Vincennes, presided over by future President William Henry Harrison, asked Congress to repeal Article 6, and in 1806, the territory adopted a new law titled, quote, An Act Concerning Slaves and Servants, unquote. This was nothing less than a full slave code. During this entire period leading up to the admission of Illinois as a free state in 1818, not one action was taken in the territory to free the slaves in the region. After 1803, under Virginia native and territorial Governor Harrison, slavery began to actually expand in the territory, and this continued after statehood. When Illinois applied for admission in 1818, DeWitt Clinton protege James Talmadge of New York fiercely opposed statehood based on the fact that slavery was still rampant in the territory. Not until 1848, when Illinois adopted a new state constitution, was slavery officially abolished in Illinois. The Louisiana Purchase was the golden opportunity to put Jefferson's diffusion scheme into practice. Many Federalist leaders opposed the purchase, but Hamilton and Morris were not among them. Morris wrote a letter of congratulation to Robert Livingston, and both he and Hamilton spoke out praising what this would mean for the future of the nation. But the New Yorkers were also aware of the potential grave danger. And Morris and Jay both insisted that as the vast new territory was federal land, not previously part of or claimed by any pre-existing state like Tennessee and Kentucky, that the anti-slavery principle of the Northwest Ordinance must be imposed on the new territory. With Jefferson and Madison running the country, settlers from Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Kentucky poured across the Mississippi River, and with them came their slaves. New Orleans was quickly transformed into the slave hub of the South, and the state of Louisiana was admitted as a slave state in 1812 under Madison. Following the War of 1812, the slave power land grab became an avalanche. Mississippi and Alabama, which were formed on land partially seized from Spain, were admitted as slave states. Arkansas continued as a slave territory in 1819. Missouri was admitted in 1821 as a slave state, and Florida organized as a slave territory in 1822. In a mere 10 years, 341,000 square miles of new territory had been brought under the control of the slave power. This was the intent all along, to crush the Republic of Hamilton and his allies and replace it with a slaveocracy. This was the goal of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe from no later than 1789 and probably earlier. In 1800, almost half the slaves in the United States were in Virginia. Another 35% were in Maryland and the Carolinas. This is the actual Jeffersonian Republican movement. All right. Well, let me stop and Mobster, you're making a point I think that I was going to get to, but I didn't have enough time. The Jacobites were deported to southern states, and it's very important that we start distinguishing the Jacobites from the New Englanders in terms of their way that they looked and thought at things, and also to consider that George Washington may have been one. And I don't know if that attitude of his, if he was in fact, in favor of the House of Stuart or not. Did he reject uh, George III as a monarch at all? Did he say, well, no, George III is not a king. He's just simply, an imposter, and the real king is still the Stuart line? Um, don't know. But let me try and wrap it up in one more minute. When we talk about the Cabell family, we're talking about a family that was allied with Jefferson way, way back. When we talk about families named um, uh, Byrd, uh, that's another one that goes way, way back. And we talk about the aristocracy that was the Blue Bloods of Virginia. And it's important that we recognize the fact that these guys were emanating the aristocracies of Europe and France. And why is it that Jefferson is connected with France? It's because of his connection to the royalty in France through Pierre Dupont and Louis XVI, whose treasury was spent to defeat Great Britain, supporting the American Revolution. These are the royalist side. These are the monarchists. And when you put together, and I think that where I really wanted to flesh this out, and I haven't had time, is to look, and then we'll do this another time, with how the DuPont family fits in with George Washington, and also with Jefferson, and also the DuPont family fits in with the businessman's coup in 1933 and the idea of the synarchy, which we've discussed so many times, being a third power that we don't often see between the West and the Nazis. Mussolini basically is associated with this group. It is the old monarchists in France, and that ties it all right back to Thomas Jefferson's connection to France and their support of serfdom, slavery, and the exploitation of labor in an agricultural world, as opposed to the manufacturing values of the North. And we'll have to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Stay tuned for George Webb here on Neighborhood News Studio.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again to John O'Loughlin, aka McDuff. You can, for all the people out there on McDuff Lives 1 And 2, make sure you go to McDuff Lives 3. He has strikes on the other channel, and you want to make sure you're up to date on all your McDuff content. And once again, you can find him at screamingospreys.com. Make sure you scroll down and buy his dad's book, McDuff Lives. But we are continuing the show here on neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We have Mr. George Webb coming up next at 12 p.m. and we have Mark Kulak coming at 2 p.m. and